Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My previous speakers, particularly the introductory speech, as well as the previous speaker, have spoken a lot about the details about the South China Sea dispute. So for the brevity of time, I think I would avoid mentioning them. What I would do is to reiterate some of those facts in order to flag out some of the points that I want to present to you in relation to the South China Sea dispute. The first point that I want to emphasize is that Chinese claim on the South China Sea is essentially based on a shoddy historical claim. Now, historical claims are not supported by international law, number one. And what is more important is that if someone refers to history, if all countries decide to refer to history to establish their sovereignty, I think the whole world will be topsy-turvy. For example, if India decides to say that, well, the whole of subcontinent was one India at one time, so Bangladesh, Pakistan should come under India, quite justified by history, because it was one country at one time. So my submission would be that let's not talk about history, because sometimes history can be more explosive than nuclear weapons that can create real problems. Number two point, that this recent activities in building or elevating some of the islets into islands are nothing new. I think there is a systematic attempt on the part of the Chinese to establish its claim, de facto claim, on South China Sea. And I think my previous speakers have already mentioned about those developments beginning from 1974 up to today. China has always made a systematic occupation of the features by stealth, or what is known as sometimes the creeping occupation or salami slicing strategy that China adopts. Now, I think there is a systematic attempt, and China takes advantage. The third point that I want to establish is that if you look at the developments beginning from 1974, you will notice that at each and every stage, whenever China took a certain action, it always utilized the weakness of its adversary. In 74, when it occupied the Paracels and also 7 islands in the Spratlys for the Vietnamese, South Vietnam was very weak, and obviously it was the changeover of power. So each and every opportunity that China sort of, saw when its adversary was weak, or when the international situation would not permit any of the external powers to get involved, China took advantage of the situations there. So, I mean, that is the third point that I want to highlight, that it always tries to take weakness of the adversary. And why, as somebody asked, that why is China has started this hectic activity in sort of dredging and filling up those places and building up into islands? I think some explanation could be that in 2016, the International Tribunal might come out with a judgment on the Filipino referral, and it may even go against China. Not that China really bothers very much, but I think before the tribunal comes out with a certain judgment, China wants to establish its de facto authority in the South China Sea, so that, on the ground, the facts are there. So even if there is a judgment, it won't make much of a difference. The second reason why I think the Chinese are also very, carrying on these hectic activities is also due to the fact that American president is almost like a lame duck president now. And the next presidential election will take place next year in 2016. And I think China is expecting, or many people are expecting, that a Republican candidate might become the president of the country, and a Republican candidate might have a much harsher attitude towards China. So again, China wants to establish the hard facts of its occupation of those areas. The fourth point that I want to establish is that China does not or China respects international norms and conduct, as well as law, only when it suits its interests. If it doesn't suit its interests, China shuffles between bilateralism and multilateralism. China talks about advantages of multilateralism, but when it finds that ASEAN countries might put some kind of a pressure on China together, then it shifts to bilateral. China wants to deal with South China Sea on the bilateral basis, not on multilateral basis. The fifth point that I want to establish is that it's my own opinion that China realizes that the most important factor in this whole dispute and the way things are going to evolve in course of time is the importance of ASEAN countries, the neighbors. China is worried about United States, worried about Japan's, that they might try to support some of these countries in their dispute. But China knows that if ASEAN could be managed, the other external powers cannot really intervene in a big way. And that is why the strategy that China adopts is to divide the ASEAN countries. China makes a distinction between those who have claims in the South China Sea and those who do not have claims. And that is why China tries to play the one group against the other. And in the process has kept the ASEAN divided. And if ASEAN is not united, even if the United States have its, what we call the pivot in the region, it will be extremely difficult for the United States to take any actions against the Chinese. So what the Chinese are trying to do, number one, is that drive a wedge within the ASEAN, and number two, keep the ASEAN countries' good humor by inducements. Now the Chinese have started this, what is known as the Silk Road, as well as the ASEAN Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. Now through these inducements, by giving opportunities to these countries to develop their own infrastructure with the capital coming from these banks and other, China was trying to give inducement to these countries not to follow the Western line on the South China Sea, so that it accepts China's sovereignty and accepts China's supremacy within the region. Now, that is why China adopts both this policy, drive a wedge within the ASEAN countries, and then you also try to sort of give inducement to these countries. But having said all this, I would like to argue that ASEAN is a very critical factor in this. There are two instances when ASEAN came out with a very strong statement. One was in 1995, in May, I believe, when the Mischief Reef incident took place. The Filipino foreign minister was able to persuade some other countries of ASEAN to issue a joint statement saying that it disturbs peace and stability. China's actions disturbs peace and stability in the region. And you see, immediately after 95, China took a back role. China withdrew from some of the features at that time. And again, of course, it came back, but still it was quite worried about ASEAN's unity. Now, from that time onwards, China made it a point to see that ASEAN cannot issue a joint statement on the South China Sea. Fortunately or unfortunately, whatever you might say, that this time, things have changed a little bit. And that's why in the last ASEAN meeting on 27th of last month, the ASEAN foreign minister and the host country, Malaysia, came out with a statement saying that China's action, it didn't mention China, but it says the actions in the South China Sea erodes trust and confidence and poses a threat to the security of the region. Now, why this sudden change within ASEAN? And whether ASEAN will be able to play an important role in this South China Sea? I think until about 2 years back, countries for example, like Indonesia and Malaysia, which were on the sidelines in the dispute. Indonesia doesn't have any claim on the South China Sea, and Malaysia, of course, has a claim. But in the last 2 years, in 2013 and 2014, China's actions, I mean, Chinese ships have visited James Shoal, the southernmost sort of part of China's claim, and there, in fact, I mean, the warships were there, and not only that, even on the, in the coast closer to Malaysia, in 2013, the Chinese had made military exercises. Now, both these incidents, interestingly, were not reported in the Malaysian press, because Malaysia always publicly tries to bandwagon with China, but privately, I have spoken to some of the diplomats as well as the defense officials in Malaysia. They were extremely worried. And in fact, the reports that came out of this China's actions was not in the Malaysian press, but in Xinhua, Chinese press, which actually gave a kind of a sort of, a filler to these countries that after all we are there. Now, it seems the Malaysian diplomats were told privately that, okay, don't worry, we are there, but you can bring your, I mean, so you can be there in James Shoal, but don't bring any oil rig there. Now, without the oil rig, I mean, they cannot really do any oil exploration. So it almost virtually is told that don't really do anything. And I think the red line in the Malaysian sort of position would be that if they're not allowed to use the oil exploration in those regions. And that's why you see there's a certain shift in the position. And in fact, now the Malaysians are trying to also establish a kind of a base in a place called Bintulu in Sarawak in order to see that, some of these Chinese actions could be prevented in that region. And Indonesia, for example, was again absolutely neutral and in fact played a very mediatory role in South China Sea dispute. But in the last 2 years, again, the so-called or infamous 9-dotted line actually passed through the Natuna Island of Indonesia, and that has created a kind of a sort of, that has sent an alarm signal to some of the Indonesians that, what the Chinese are trying to do. And recently, the Indonesian president, Joko Widodo, has come out with a maritime concept. In Indonesian, it's called Poros Maritime Dunia, that is the world maritime axis. Now, that world maritime axis actually clashes with 9-dotted line. And in fact, again, Indonesian government has not issued any official statement on these things, but the chief of the army, Muldoko, about a year back made a statement that there is a dangerous situation in the region and Indonesia should try to sort of station some air units in that region. So you see a certain shift in the position of the ASEAN. Now, whether they will be able to sustain. Now, interestingly, on 27th, the Kuala Lumpur statement came out. 28th, the Global Times, Xinhua, and the entire Chinese press came out with almost a stinging attack on the ASEAN countries, saying that, it is an insult to China, we are not doing anything, we are peaceful and all that. So the point that I'm trying to drive at is that ASEAN opinion matters more to the Chinese. And if ASEAN countries can show a certain amount of unity, which may be difficult because the next meeting of ASEAN will be held in Laos, which is totally sold out to the Chinese for their own development. In fact, Chinese are building a whole new city in Laos. So I think Laotians are not going to give, maybe they will behave in the same way as Cambodia behaved 2 years back. But the point that I'm trying to drive at is that ASEAN can maintain their unity. I think Chinese actions could be stopped. And of course, I mean, the other points that the speakers have already mentioned, that it creates a lot of uncertainties and tension because the United States, Japan, all are now getting involved in the whole dispute, including my own country, India, which of course has maintained a kind of a neutral stand, saying that it should resolve the crisis through peaceful means. But at the same time, India highlighted the point that it is a threat to the navigation. And even India's own trade passes through that region. About more than 60% of its trade passes through that region. So India also has an extended sort of interest in the South China Sea. But the dispute looks to be intractable at the moment. The one way to resolve the crisis could be having a code of conduct. The declaration of conduct, which was signed in 2002, and within 10 years they were supposed to have the code of conduct, but that has not progressed very much, essentially because of China's intransigence. So one is not sure whether the code of conduct will be signed shortly. But one way to resolve the crisis would have been to have a kind of a code of conduct that would have restricted the activities of some of these claimant states. Thank you very much.